Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome John Harwood of CNBC and the New York Times and our distinguished panel to the stage.
Good morning. I was told that the voice of God would introduce me, but that I would substitute for the voice of God to introduce the senators, which was cool, but I can't really do it that well. When I was at the Wall Street Journal, I once did a story on the leading voices behind Republican and Democratic political ads, and both of them worked out of their houses. They had little studios, and I would go in, and the one guy would say, "You want me to do voice of God?" And I say, "Yeah." And it was so awesome that it was God. But our two guests are Sheldon Whitehouse, Democratic Senator from Rhode Island, member of the Budget Committee, which is the relevant role that he plays. He does a lot of other things too. And Mike Enzi, who's the chairman of the Budget Committee, Republican Senator from the state of Wyoming. Let me start out just before I get to the budget process reform with the stuff that everybody really wants to hear, which is, I recognize that you've endorsed Hillary Clinton. However, you are a superdelegate. Bernie Sanders carried your state overwhelmingly. He just carried West Virginia last night. Are you going to be susceptible to his argument to look at the polls, see who beats Donald Trump more, and switch over to Bernie Sanders?
I'm convinced that Secretary Clinton is our best candidate.
That's a no. Okay.
I would say, yeah.
Now,
correct.
Now, Senator Enzi, I've seen that Alan Simpson, your predecessor as senator, has said that Donald Trump would be a disaster who would bring chaos to the Republican Party. However, Dick Cheney, also from your home state, former vice president, has endorsed him. Where do you come down on your running mate? I mean, on your presumptive nominee?
Well, until it's beyond presumptive, I have never endorsed a presidential candidate. But I'm kind of excited that we might have an actual businessman in the White House who has been through down times as well as up times, and a lot of down times. And our country, as we talk about the budget, we'll find is in a bit of a downtime. We need to be doing better than we're doing.
So,
I think he can do it. Yes.
Okay. Now, let's talk about the budget. And you've got some ideas for reforming the budget process, and you've been talking about them in your committee. I want to start with a question for both of you on a kind of a bipartisan basis. I remember when Democrats controlled the Congress, and they couldn't pass the budget and couldn't pass their appropriations bills on time. Republicans would say, "Look how incompetent the Democrats are. They can't do it. They can't govern." Now Republicans are in charge. We don't have a budget, and all the appropriations bills are not going to be done on time. Are both of you willing to permanently park that line of attack against the other party and say it's the process and not the party who's in charge?
I think we've already done that and are making...
I made that point in the Budget Committee just the other day. I gave the Republicans a pass on doing what we had already done.
Or not done.
But I would mention that one of my reasons for doing that and to try and do a new process is that a year ago we did a budget and we passed it. It was a very partisan budget, and the appropriators, the spending committees, took that budget, stayed within that budget, passed 11 of the 12 bills in a bipartisan way. And then 6 months later we wound up with a big deal that spent another $80 billion. So the budget process isn't working. It's a broken process, and we need to fix it. And I think that's why we're working together, to see some way that we can eliminate those vote-a-ramas that go on for hours and hours and are just designed to embarrass each side. That doesn't result in any kind of a conclusion that actually sets any priorities, figures out where we're going to go, or has any specificity that will actually happen. One of the things that I've noticed as I did this is that the President's budget, the Budget Committee's budget, the Appropriators' budget, and the Authorizing Committee's budgets are all different formats. So there's no way to trace the dollars. That's a major problem right there.
Now, let me stop you guys for a second and ask about the Votorama in particular, because I saw that that's come up in your materials. That strikes me as something that is a pure reflection of what people hate about Washington. That is to say, it is, as Senator Enzi just said, entirely devised for political purposes and not for substantive purposes. Explain to people in this audience and who may be watching otherwise exactly what that process is.
The compromise in the early Budget Act was that the majority party would be allowed to shove through a budget with a simple majority of votes, but that there would be unlimited open season on amendments for the minority party, which in a highly partisan environment opens itself up to just potshots back and forth, with the result being that the process that is supposed to be the sort of high point of congressional responsibility to limit the debt of the country and set a spending and revenue path for it turns into a comedy of mutual insult and demeaning behavior. And I think that as we go forward with the process that Chairman Enzi has initiated, the low-hanging fruit is going to be to make the process less demeaning to the Senate. And that's a key part of it, along with several other little elements. And if we can get beyond that, then it would be nice to have it be less irrelevant to the Senate. That would be stage 2. And if we can really pull something off, then step 3 would be to make it more effective at achieving the intended goals of a budget committee, which is to set that responsible path for our country, and if we're off it, to set a glide slope for getting there.
Mr. Chairman, go ahead.
We left out a little part there because there's also a votorama in the committee meeting when you do the budget, and it's equally unproductive. But I did offer to Senator Sanders before we ever started on that budget that the usual process is that on a Wednesday you do your opening statements in committee, and Wednesday night you get a copy of the budget, which isn't very helpful. And then on Thursday you do unlimited amendments.
The opening statements come before the budget.
Correct.
Yes. So I offered to give him the budget much earlier in exchange for having a deadline for turning in amendments the day before. And that way we'd know how many amendments there were going to be, what kind of arguments each side would have, and hopefully limit it more.
Did he take that deal?
No. No, we went with the old process, and we did the old process on the floor too, which could have been a limited number of votes on each side. And
in practice, how many votes were there? How many amendments were offered in Votorama?
there were 183 amendments offered.
How many voted on?
I think we voted on 57.
And how many of them are going to end up in campaign commercials going after one or the other side?
Probably, except it's kind of old news now. So I think some of it's already been used that way. And a lot of the amendments seemed to make a point, but really had no effect. We set up a whole bunch of reserves. And I guess we could have eliminated that whole process by just putting a reserve on everything to start with.
The deficit neutral budget reserve fund is one of the little quirks of the budget process that we would probably do well to be rid of, because I don't think one has ever accomplished anything actual in the history of the Budget Committee.
Now, Mr. Chairman, tell me how you solve this problem. What is a way to avoid the comedy, the political gamesmanship, without being vulnerable to what we heard throughout the Republican primary campaign, which was the Republican establishment, the Washington cartel is controlling things and needs to be shaken up? Because aren't you always going to be vulnerable to that charge from somebody in your caucus or his caucus?
Well, if that's going to be our main worry, this country is probably in a lot of trouble. What we're going to have to do with the process is involve the president earlier than we do. The president right now is at an advantage if he can hold up the entire spending process until October 1st. And then he has the wedge of not wanting a government shutdown to give him some extra leverage to get what he wants in the budget. And that's whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. It doesn't matter. That's the way we've been doing it for years, and it's just wrong. People ought to know, in business, you have to know what you're going to spend before you spend it. In government, you get to spend 1/12 of what you spent the year before each month until a budget's approved. Sometimes that can be less money, sometimes it's never more money. But if we have a shutdown, then we also have all of the people not at work, and then when we come back, we pay them for the time that they didn't work, which is a huge expense. So a shutdown costs a lot of money and isn't productive. We've got to find a way that the agencies all know what they get to spend a long time in advance. I'd love to see biennial budgeting so that they know 2 years in advance what they're going to spend. That's both budgeting and appropriations, so they know 2 years. And I think that would save at least 5%, just looking at how much the agencies spend in that last month before October 1st to get their last year's budget spent up before they have to defend the next one. And I think that costs us 5% a year. So it'd only cost us 5% once every 2 years if we did a biennial budgeting.
Senator Whitehouse, you like 2-year budgeting?
It's certainly on the table. There are lots of potential devils in the details, but we have...
What's the downside of it? What's the potential devil in that?
Well, if you were to break it up, or what you do with 2-year appropriations, do those match? There are a lot of pretty major questions that need to be answered. But the Ryan Murray compromise was effectively 2 years, and the recent top-line budget deal was again 2 years. And I think we have heard on the Budget Committee nothing but relief and appreciation from the agencies that they had that long before they had to go through a budget process again. I would say that I think the two key points that we need to address, one has been that the Senate has moved to being a 60-vote institution for anything serious. The penalty...
Appropriately, by the way?
It is what it is. The penalty...
Some people talk about getting rid of the filibuster.
Separate question entirely. The penalty for violating the budget as the Budget Committee has proposed it, if it's passed, is that you have to, as an appropriator, gather 60 instead of 51 votes. Well, now if you're an appropriator, you have to gather 60 votes anyway. So there's zero penalty to blowing through the budget if you're an appropriator. The appropriators basically own the process now because of that simple procedural change. And that's, I think, one important feature. The second is we have to just find a way to distinguish between a Budget Committee effort that is sincere and bipartisan and one party firing out its budget with no support from the other side and no effort to reach a conclusion. There's a difference between those two and how seriously the body should treat that effort, I believe.
Isn't the prospect that we would get to the situation that Senator Whitehouse just suggested, that is a bipartisan budget, isn't that a fanciful proposition in our politics right now?
I don't think so. I think it is possible for people to work together if both sides can be involved, and if we start to solve some of the really big problems that our country has. We have a $19 trillion debt now, moving to $20 trillion, and at 1%, that's $200 billion in interest a year. The norm is 5%. You multiply that 200 times 5, you're at $1 trillion. The only decisions we got to make this year were on $1 trillion. The other $3 trillion are all mandatory spending, and we don't have the control over that. And what everybody wants is for their part of the budget to be mandatory. That way they can count on it before, outside of the budget window. Of course, that all hinges on whether we have the money to do it. And if we start spending the whole $1 trillion on interest instead of defense and education and agriculture and health care and all of the other things, there's going to be an attempt to take the money from Social Security or some other place. So we're going to have to get we're going to have to start including everything in the budget.
Which
everything
should probably include what a lot of the economists who've come before us call tax spending. I think it's been really nearly universal among the economists who've come in to testify, whatever their conservative versus liberal persuasion might be, that tax spending is spending. And if you are a special interest and you have the choice between pulling strings to get an appropriation in a particular year versus pulling strings to get an equivalent value tax benefit that then gets baked into the tax code and is yours year after year after year, clearly your incentive is to bake your goodies into the tax code. And that has been taking place for decades, and it leaves us a rich mine of really unjustified tax spending to look at.
Senator Enzi, you agree with him on that, even though a lot of members of your party would describe those as tax cuts rather than tax spending?
Well, I think we ought to be taking a look at every revenue source and seeing whether they're justified or not. I've already done a lot of those, and some of the things that we're talking about as tax expenditures, I think if we actually sat down and looked at them, we'd agree that they weren't. And of course, all of them were designed as incentive originally. And I suspect that there's going to be some need for incentive when we have an economy that's only 0.5%, and the norm would be 2 7/10%. And for every 1% that we lose in GDP, and incidentally, that's just the private sector, for every 1% that we lose, according to the Office of Management and Budget, which is the president's budgeter, we lose $400 billion a year in taxes. So that's without changing taxes. So there's a lot of money out there that has to be discussed in that context as well.
More money actually goes out the back door of the tax code in tax spending than is spent through appropriations.
Senator Whitehouse, did you support that most recent budget deal, compromise budget deal?
Yes.
Did you, Senator Enzi?
No.
Did not. Why not?
I did not. We had that go through the spending committees already, and the spending committees in a bipartisan way stuck with that budget. So it seemed to me like a good budget. And looking at the future, I used to say that we were stealing from our grandkids. We've stolen so much money that we're now stealing from our kids. And the big shock that we're going to have in just a few years is we're going to be stealing from ourselves. And that really worries me. So I'm trying to figure out some ways to solve the budget problem so that we quit piling on all of the debt. And part of our problem is that in our bills, we don't have a lot of specificity on what we're trying to achieve, so we can go back and see if we achieved it. We work on a baseline budget, so essentially the agencies can know that they're going to have the same amount they had before, plus an inflationary increase. And beyond that, we don't look at a lot of detail. That's for the agency itself. Within the agency, we may make some differences.
Do you agree with Donald Trump then that budget deal, he calls it a horrible deal that is going to increase our debt? Is that how you felt about it?
Well, it's not the way that we're supposed to go about it. I'm trying to change it so that we can go about it in a proper way. And having it just a partisan budget is not the right way to go. Having the president involved at an earlier time is essential. And having the other party involved in what the priorities are is essential. But there has to be a way to work out a mechanism, and we've been holding a bunch of hearings, which I prefer to call kind of round tables because they aren't the normal hearing style. We have people come in that have actually done some things. One was from New Zealand, where they did a major budget reform, and they tell us what they did and how they did it and how it worked out, and hopefully what they wouldn't ever do again. And it puts a lot more focus on what we're trying to achieve and seeing if we're achieving it. But the main thing is most of the countries that have a successful budgeting process start with determining how much revenue they're going to have and how that relates to the GDP and setting some limits on that, and then also have some figures in there based on the interest costs. And that sets a top line, which is movable because you can always do more revenue or less revenue, but have everybody vote on that first. Then you have a basis to start with, and that gets divided up then among the different priorities we have. But we also have this problem with mandatory spending. We've got a great health care bill, but they want to put that into mandatory spending too. 20 years ago, we got to decide on 67% of what was what the federal government was getting. Now we've made so many things mandatory that 70% of the things we don't get to look at.
You guys are playing with the small change in the appropriations and budgeting process.
Yes,
And then you throw in tax spending, which is 100% mandatory
Right.
because of the way it's baked into the tax code, and you really have an enormous amount of the calculation that leads to our debt and deficits that is beyond the current purview of the Budget Committee. And it really takes us to a point where I think we're having a serious conversation in the committee that, as its top line, asks, should there even be a Budget Committee?
Right.
Or is it just a waste of everybody's time? If you are going to have one, you need to have the major players, the majority leader, the minority leader, the finance committee chair and ranking, the appropriations chair and ranking, and just have it be a power center for people who already control those levers. Or third, do you try to rebuild an independent budget committee to do its job? And what Chairman Enzi and I think a lot of members on both sides of the aisle would like to take a run at is Plan 3. But if we can't make that work, then if all we're going to do is produce an annual vote-a-rama and a budget that nobody believes in, then we have better and more important things to do than that performance.
Well, on that point, it sounds as if it were up to you and Senator Enzi, you guys could make a deal on this, but it's not. So give us a realistic assessment of the prospects for actually achieving some effective version of budget reform of the kind that you all are discussing.
Well, let me just remark on the turnout of the Budget Committee members at these sessions that Chairman Enzi has set up. There has been a lot of attendance. It has been bipartisan attendance. You could close your eyes and swap sides and very often not know whether the comment was made by a Republican or Democrat member because it's very about the process and trying to make it work. But on our side, Senator King and Senator Kaine have been particularly active and helpful. On Chairman Enzi's side, we've seen Senator Ayotte showing up a lot, Senator Perdue showing up a lot. There's been, I think, strong bipartisan interest. I'll let the chairman follow up, but I think that this is an issue where there's going to be, again, the devil's going to be in the details, but the desire to go forward in good faith and in a constructive way, I think, is very widespread around the committee on both sides of the aisle.
Mr. Chairman, do you agree with that? Secondly, is Leader McConnell interested in this subject? And since it's possible that it'll be Leader Schumer next year, is he interested in this process?
Well, I haven't talked to Leader Schumer. I have talked to Senator McConnell, and he has said that if we have something that is a bipartisan bill that will actually work, that as soon as we get through the 12 appropriations bills, of course, maybe we never will, but
I thought you're only going to do 5 this year.
No, the intent is to do all 12. I think it's been over 20 years since that ever happened, and we're on kind of a slow pace. We could finish up the first one today, and hopefully we can avoid the omnibus, though. I think one of the reasons that the appropriators like the budget format that they have that's different than the budget format we have is that it allows them to put a lot of giving in there. And it's more fun to give money than it is to evaluate money. And so the appropriators have always been the difficulty on making any kind of a change. So we'll have to sell them on it as well.
That'll take some selling because as the impact of the Budget Committee has evaporated, that has conferred all of that authority over to the appropriators or to the big deal makers who are in the room when the president and the speaker and the majority leader and minority leader get together and make that super deal. And again, that's not the way we want our government to work. Things that are done by a very small group of people in a room with nobody looking and then get thrown out to a vote. You got 4 hours to decide how you're going to vote, and then, you know, that's the end of it. Then later you start looking through what was passed and you find all the little.
Well, you mentioned the president being a critical player in those endgame processes. Is there any indication that either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump have paid any attention to this issue at all?
None that I know of.
Not that I mean, this is really an in-house issue in the Senate, and it's important. But my point is that the effort that Chairman Enzi is leading, and that we hope to work together on throughout the committee, is one that has some natural rivals in the form of the Appropriations Committee and in the form of the leadership, who don't necessarily dislike being the only ones in the room where it happens, as they say in Hamilton.
I want to close by asking you about the big picture related to the other 70% that you all don't control. I had what I thought was kind of a depressing lunch the other day with a former Republican leadership aide to Senator McConnell. Was asking about prospects for a deal on entitlements, which is something that's been elusive during the Obama presidency. And his answer was, we will not have a deal until the crisis is right on us, because we can't, as a body, act in advance of that, so that people will talk about doing something on Medicare and Social Security for another half dozen years, maybe 10 years, and then when it's on us, when the baby boom retirement's at its peak and we're in a crisis, that's when it'll happen. Do you agree with that?
You need a crisis usually to get something done, but we're in a crisis. It's at the small end of the wave right now. We aren't to the tsunami yet, but yeah, the coal miners' health and the coal miners' pensions are on the edge right now. And those of us with coal miners are trying to figure out how they're going to continue to have their health care and the pensions that they were promised. And I've worked on pensions before, and I know that the central trucking companies are all on the verge of having their pensions go into the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation as well. That would bankrupt the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation and would take away pensions from a whole lot of people. So we're already there. We aren't there with Social Security yet. That's because we have a lot of bonds in a drawer that are worth the full faith and credit of the United States, that are the surplus funds from what came in from people that were working versus what was paid out to people who had retired. Now that with the baby boomers coming in, we're paying out more than comes in. So that trust fund is in trouble, not immediately in trouble. But we're going to have to take a look at these others and figure out how to solve those problems. And it will make a great point on what's going to happen with Social Security and the other trust funds that the federal government has.
Senator, how far out are we from Congress doing something about both major entitlement programs?
Well, I think that whoever is elected president, there will be a serious look taken at the debt and the deficits. I think there'll be less partisanship. I think that card has been played so hard now that people are kind of sick of it on both sides, I hope. And I'm confident that as long as revenues and tax spending is a part of the equation, we can have really productive bipartisan conversations. But it's going to be really, really hard to try to get Democrats to come into a room and say, we're here to talk about cutting Social Security, but having hedge fund billionaires pay carried interest tax rates that are lower than brick masons in your home state, that's not on the table. We can't discuss that. That's way too precious. So, you know, there's a point when it's really serious, when people are willing to put revenues, tax spending, and regular spending all on the table together, and that's when a deal can come together. But you can't just pretend that the tax spending isn't real and that it's all untouchable when so much of it really smells to high heaven, actually.
Well, that was a hopeful note, less partisanship after the election. But I think we could all agree that, go ahead.
Actually, what we do has to be done before the election. Mm-hmm. Right now, one of the reasons that we're
our
working
piece,
together
yes,
is, our piece has to be done before the election, because right now, nobody knows who the president's going to be and nobody knows who the majority in Congress is going to be. So we can take a very reasonable approach to make sure that we protect the majority and the minority and come up with a plan that'll work.
but we're not going to fix protecting Social Security and Medicare. We're just going to fix the Budget Committee if we can.
Yeah. Or eliminate it if we have to.
or eliminate if we have to.
I think we can all agree that we would be better off if we had more serious legislators like these. Join me in thanking Sheldon Whitehouse and Mike Ensign.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.